Okay, so as you saw in our last couple of slides, this war is going horribly wrong for the Johnson administration. And Johnson, I think, shocks some people, probably doesn't surprise others when he announces, with the situation going on in the war the way it is, that he no longer seeks or will even accept the Democratic Party's nomination for him to run for a second term as President of the United States. So we're going to get into the election of 1968 at a different time. That's a whole nother story in and of itself. But suffice it to say for now that after the Johnson administration and the Democratic Party, in the eyes of many Americans, had failed in this war, I guess it's not too much of a surprise that the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, who, as we know, had run before and failed against Kennedy, wins the election of 1968 and becomes president. So, Nixon's whole take on this war is not necessarily that he wants to get out of it quickly. His slogan is peace with honor. So he wants to get the United States out of this war, but he wants to do it on his terms, on U.S. terms, and on terms that he feels are good for the security of the United States. But the war doesn't go that much better for Nixon. Another term he uses for his approach is the Vietnamization of the war. He's going to kind of shift the burden of fighting this war more on the ARVN forces, the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam. Um, but there's a lot of problems with that too. Other thing that he does is he really steps up the air campaign against North Vietnam, mainly not necessarily for military strategic reasons, but more to try to force the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table and get them to sign some kind of truce and get them out of the war, which would enable the U.S. to then focus on the Viet Cong. Also, not that successful. Also comes into heavy fire for critics who feel that the bombing in North Vietnam really is taking way too much of a civilian toll as opposed to strategic military targets. But things really go wrong in the early 1970s for Nixon, and I think one of the big stories here is something that has become known as the Pentagon Papers. Excuse me. So this happens when Daniel Ellsberg, who is a former Department of Defense analyst who spent some time in intelligence in Vietnam himself, leaks a bunch of secret documents to the New York Times, and these documents are basically internal narratives about how the war is going. And one of the problems is when the New York Times starts publishing these narratives, one of the things that people start to see is that at the same time the government was reporting that the war was going well and that this war was going to be won, internally, very early on, as early as 1966, not even a year into the war, these papers start to show that many of the people in the inner circle of the Department of Defense realized that this war was not going well, we were not winning, and that maybe success wasn't even possible. So as the New York Times starts publishing excerpts from these Pentagon Papers little by little, the Nixon administration basically tries to put an injunction on the New York Times saying that they cannot publish these stories because they are a threat to national security and are classified. The Times stops publishing them while they fight this case in court, very famous Supreme Court case. There's a link to it in your slide if you're interested in learning more about the New York Times versus the United States. But while the Times isn't publishing these stories, and a very interesting example of big media cooperation, the Times basically works with the Washington Post and gives them the information, and the Washington Post continues to publish excerpts from the Pentagon Papers and continues to damage the reputation of the government in terms of how they are running this war. Um, just a side note, the Supreme Court rules in favor of the New York Times, saying that the Nixon administration did not do a good enough job in proving why and how national security was at risk. Therefore, the New York Times could, in the future, publish such stories and did not have to follow the injunction. One of the things that I'd like you to think about after learning about the Pentagon Papers, and keep this question in your mind as we go into the next couple of slides, is how events like the Pentagon Papers and the things that we're going to talk about, how they started to impact the way that Americans felt about their government, the trust that Americans had in their government, and the way that could shape our national character for years to come. So we've been examining and exploring different factors that caused this war to go so wrong for us. And I don't want to diminish any other factor, but I think strategically, one of the major problems we had with this war and with implementing Westmoreland's strategy of search and destroy is the fact that the nations to the west of South Vietnam, like Cambodia, were serving as a refuge for the Viet Cong. So this enabled the Viet Cong to do two things that we just could not find an answer to. One, if you take a look at the map on the right of the slide, you'll see the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail, which came down, which was basically a supply chain coming down from North Vietnam through the safe haven of Laos and Cambodia, where we could not attack them, delivering critical supplies, weapons, and things like that to the Viet Cong and South Vietnam. So the countries of Laos and Cambodia provided a protected supply chain. That was one problem. The other thing, which became evident, particularly, but this happened throughout the war, but particularly through the Tet Offensive, is that the Viet Cong were enabled to launch attacks mainly in the central highlands, the central part of South Vietnam, as well as the western borders of South Vietnam. They could launch attacks against ARVN forces and U.S. forces, and then escape to places like Cambodia where we could not follow them. So this plagues us throughout the war. It's a major advantage for the Viet Cong. So when Nixon comes to office, it's kind of, although he's pushing the Vietnamization of this war, he does kind of come out of this from a let's take the gloves off perspective and maybe make this war a little less limited than it's been. So one of the things that he begins with Operation Menu in late 1969 is really kind of secret operations and attacks across the western border of South Vietnam into Cambodia. This is also accompanied by an air war against Viet Cong positions in Cambodia. And it's in the spring of 1961 that Nixon announces to the American public that this war, a war that he kind of came to office talking about peace with honor and kind of the Vietnamization of this war and lessening the burden on the United States, he now comes on television and explains that we have now expanded this war beyond Vietnam into the nation of Cambodia. We have in fact invaded Cambodia. So you can imagine, after 1968, the majority of the Americans, are against this war. And obviously the Tet Offensive plays one key role in that. But you can imagine how Americans who think it's time to get out of this war, they've elected a president who talks about the Vietnamization of this war, and now it's announced that this war has in fact actually escalated to more countries. So think about, again, how that would have affected public opinion about the war. And like we said with the Pentagon Papers, think about the fact that when Americans felt that while Nixon is announcing this in 71, that in many ways we had expanded this war into Cambodia before that without the knowledge of the American public and without the permission of Congress. So think about also how that would have affected Americans' opinions about their government, trust in their government, the kinds of themes and big ideas we've been talking about all year in this course. So when it's discovered that this war has expanded into the nation of Cambodia, the anti-war movement, which has been growing, 1968 really was a big year and a big bolstering of the anti-war movement in this country as public sentiment turns against this war. When the invasion of Cambodia comes out, that really kind of incites anti-war protesters all over the country. And a lot of these anti-war movements and organizations really are grounded in the colleges and universities across the United States. So in that spring of 1970, we see protests all over the country at college campuses. Actually, not too far away at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, there are major protests against the invasion of Cambodia. One of the universities that organizes such a protest is Kent State University in Ohio. This turns out to be really a turning point for our nation in a lot of different ways, and we're going to talk about this down the road. But basically, this is a protest that begins as a nonviolent, peaceful protest of Nixon's invasion of Cambodia. Things get out of hand. The governor of Ohio calls the National Guard to take control, and we are left with a standoff between troops, federal troops, and U.S. students protesters who are against the war. And this standoff ends with devastating and tragic consequences. So on this slide, there are two videos I'd like you to watch. The image on the left, which is, you know, one of several really pivotal pictures of post-war America, kind of shows you the part of the aftermath of the Kent State standoff. So if you click on that image, that'll give you some background information to what happened with the protest and where things went wrong. And the image on the right is another excerpt from the Dear America video. I'd like you to watch that video as well, but I'd like you to only watch that up to the 6-minute and 45-second mark. You're going to hear the perspective of a nurse, which will give you a little different perspective on the war. And then you're also going to hear a letter that comes from a soldier who's learned about the tragedy at Kent State. And I think you're going to be interested. You're going to hear how many of the soldiers had a very kind of possibly surprising view of what happened at Kent State and kind of what they take from it. So I'd like you to watch both of these videos and continue to think about our big idea of trust and the way that these things are going to make some Americans feel about our government.